Welcome to Utah Sage-Grouse Summit's Utah Plan Topic 1 Habitat Management Strategies. The objectives of this session are to provide a summary of the considerations of greater sage-grouse habitat requirements, Utah's efforts on pinyon juniper mapping and WRI tracking, Utah wildfire management and habitat restoration, and the Natural Resource Conservation Service initiative on private lands. When we begin to do habitat treatments, we need to consider the different needs throughout the year, both for males and females with and without chicks. To begin, we look at leks and the surrounding habitat that's needed in the end of February through May. Here we're looking for open areas with good views from the lek and at least 4 miles of habitat suitable for nesting and hopefully early brood rearing habitat. During the brood rearing in the summer, we're looking for a mixture of sagebrush with suitable cover to protect the hens while on the nest and to protect the chicks when they're too young to fly. These hens and chicks desire a mixture of forbs and grasses that produce insects that the chicks and hens can eat and are generally more moist or lush. For those sage-grouse without broods, the lush habitat is not necessary. Still, we'd like to see the mixture of forbs and grasses and the cover from exposure from the elements and cover from predators. In the fall and winter, the habitat's going to look decidedly different. Sage-grouse require sagebrush to eat throughout the winter, but they also require sagebrush for cover from wind and snow. The habitat's needs may change depending on the severity of the winter, the cold, and the depth of the snow. Therefore, a variety of sagebrush height and sagebrush vertical structure is required to fully meet the needs of the fall and winter habitats. We also need to consider the arrangement of the habitat. We need to consider where the habitats are in relationship to each other from year to year. For example, are the habitats adjacent or are they interspersed? We'd like to see habitat that is adjacent. The more that the birds have to fly over unsuitable habitat to get to the next season's habitat needs, the more they're in danger from predation, human disturbance, or general exposure. We want to minimize the need for sage-grouse to migrate to meet their needs. In this example here, you see that where the birds are in the wintertime, they would have to pass through potentially unsuitable habitat to get to lek and nesting habitat. Furthermore, once they're done breeding and early nesting, they would have to again pass through unsuitable habitat to get to the nesting and brood rearing habitat. So in this situation, we would look to do habitat treatments in that unsuitable habitat that would either A, provide winter habitat so that there is not unsuitable habitat between the winter and the lekking season, or some sort of contiguous habitat or habitat corridor to connect the lek and nesting season in the bottom right-hand corner to the nesting and brood rearing season in the middle of this diagram. Next, we need to look at what habitat types we have and what habitat types are available. Utah's habitat changes dramatically as you go from north to south. At the same mapping scale, you can see this picture in the upper left is more contiguous sagebrush habitat. Here it's mountain big sage and Wyoming big sage. At the same scale, if you go to the southwestern portion of Utah, you see that these two habitat types are both less present but also more fragmented, and the patches are a lot smaller. With these fragmented habitats, it's going to be more important to create corridors and to create a mosaic of suitable habitat types throughout the landscape so that the sage-grouse can move safely through the landscape and meet their habitat needs. In the northern area, it may be that you need to create diversity among these large patch sizes in age structure so that you don't have a large expanse of sagebrush that's the same age class, even though it's the same species. Finally, we need to consider site fidelity. A lot of times we create habitat and hope that the grouse go to it, but we find that the grouse do not use these areas. And that's because sage grouse actually have a site fidelity, meaning that they return to areas that they've felt safe in before, and they return to areas where they were born. So, for example, we may make habitat that's adjacent to currently used habitat types right now, and we find that the sage grouse doesn't use it. Instead, it migrates to an area over unsuitable habitat. And that's because that sage grouse learned to migrate. Over time, we'll find that the birds will use that adjacent habitat types, but that's why sometimes it takes a couple years for new habitat or habitat that we feel is suitable to be used. Birds, much like ourselves, need to do things that are safe. So if they feel that exploring a new habitat type would be unsafe, it's going to take a long time or longer than we might want for them to use that habitat, but eventually they will. And that's why creating adjacent habitats is more important than creating random habitats in the environment that may not be adjacent. It's much more unlikely that they're going to explore non-adjacent new habitat. We do know that habitat treatments work. A couple examples are Anthro Mountain in southern Duquesne County on the border of Carbon County. And we know that the broods used these prescribed burns more than expected. Grass cover was greater and sagebrush cover was lower at prescribed burn locations than the surrounding or random habitat types that were studied. Forb cover was similar to the surrounding habitat types at brood sites within and outside of prescribed burns. Sage-grouse broods did appear to be selecting prescribed burned areas more than would be expected. However, the effect of prescribed burns on sage-grouse production remains unknown because we have a limited amount of habitat available. In Bald Hills in southern Utah, we found that the birds were responding to juniper and shrub wildfires. Suitable nesting habitat was predicted in areas of Intermountain Basin montane mountain sagebrush steppe habitat, less than 5 kilometers from an active lek, and in areas that were treated or succumbed to wildfire within the previous 20 years. The importance of land cover and distance to lek was expected based on studies of sage-grouse nesting habitat preferences in other populations. However, the strong response to local habitat alterations, such as active habitat management and wildfire, was not expected. The strong response of active habitat management and wildfire rehabilitation suggests that these areas have a limited amount of habitat and the needs are high. And a final example was conducted in Alton, which is in the southwest portion of the Panguitch Wildlife Management Area. Here we studied sage-grouse use of an area that was treated for pinyon and juniper removal. The pinions and juniper were cut down and mulched, and then that area was reseeded. And you can see the difference from 2005 to 2009, how that habitat changed. Basically, it created some contiguous habitat throughout Sink Valley, created sagebrush stands in different age classes, and increased the forbs. We can see that the grouse used the treated areas almost immediately. And if you remember from the couple slides ago, I mentioned a consideration was that question of how long does it take for sage-grouse to use new and habitat? And in this situation, the answer is almost no time. So if resources are limited and you create adjacent habitat, the sage-grouse can use that habitat almost immediately. We see that they did still use pinyon and juniper for some reason, probably cover from the elements or safety from predators. We continued the effort in Alton, between Alton and the population to the north, which is Hoyt's Ranch. And within the same season of tree removal, we recorded back and forth movements of the birds between the two areas. So in essence, we opened up the travel corridor. And so this is creating redundancy of habitats, including redundancy of leks, and giving sage-grouse options based on seasonal variability that we may not be noticing, but is existing in the decision-making of the sage-grouse. So the take-home message is that we need to look at the habitat needs. What habitat is the limiting factor? How bad is the current habitat that you want to treat? And what is the redundancy of this habitat? We also need to look at habitat arrangement. What's the interspersion of these habitat needs? How far is it to the next best habitat? And what's the connectivity of the spaced habitat? Also, we need to look at scale, or the size. What's the size of the project? And how does this relate to other habitat patch sizes? Will it be just a small speck in a large landscape habitat, or will it be a rather drastic change? Also, do you have the space you need to do a habitat treatment to see the size of effect that you want? And finally, we need to consider location. Do your expectations for habitat recovery meet habitat possibility? And to consider that, you need to look at the ecological site indicators, and we need to look at climatological data to determine whether or not the moisture in the soil is suitable for the habitat treatment that you're trying to create. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the session.